I was sitting at my desk when Margot walked over with that particular expression, the one that signals a decision already made. The sprint planning meeting was scheduled for 2 hours later, and I'd spent the previous evening mapping out the authentication module I'd been assigned. 3 months of preparation, refined requirements, a technical architecture that would scale cleanly. I knew exactly what I was walking into. "Elsa," she said, not bothering with preamble. "We're going to shuffle the sprint assignments." I looked up from my monitor. Margot Chen, no relation to the Chens I'm forbidden to mention, was Moonlight Technologies' product lead, the kind of executive who measured success by quarterly metrics and the ability to impress investors during demo days. She'd been with the company for 18 months, long enough to establish her preferences, not long enough to truly understand the architecture beneath her domain. Her office overlooked the entire engineering floor from the second level of our converted warehouse space in downtown Portland. I'd watched her work through enough cycles to recognize her patterns, prioritize visibility over substance, celebrate quick wins, delegate accountability downward. "The authentication module?" I asked, though I already knew. "We're giving it to Marcus." She said his name with the kind of brightness that suggested she'd been rehearsing this conversation in her head. "He delivers flashier demos than you. His interface work gets noticed. The investors appreciate visual impact." I didn't argue. I never do in those moments. Instead, I nodded slowly, processing the implications without letting my expression shift. Professional composure was a shield I'd learned to maintain years ago, back when I first realized that emotional displays only weakened your position in corporate hierarchies. I'd seen it happen to colleagues, their frustrations interpreted as lack of confidence, their objections reframed as resistance to change. "I understand," I said quietly. She lingered for a moment, perhaps expecting pushback or resentment that might validate her decision retroactively. When neither came, she turned back toward her office. I watched her go, then returned my attention to my monitor. The spreadsheet I'd been reviewing remained open, unchanged. The technical requirements I'd outlined still occupied 7 pages of my project documentation, each line representing hours of analysis, security modeling, and forward-thinking architecture decisions. Nothing had shifted except the arena in which my work would be judged. I spent the next 30 minutes reviewing what I'd actually created during those 3 months of preparation. The authentication system I designed used a multi-layered approach to session management, incorporating token rotation, distributed cache coordination, and granular permission mapping. I'd stress-tested it mentally against 7 different failure scenarios. I'd built in redundancy for the database layer and implemented circuit breakers for third-party API dependencies. It was the kind of work that didn't photograph well in a presentation but would keep running smoothly at 3 in the morning when nobody was watching. Marcus Wendell, by contrast, was a designer who'd transitioned into product development. Talented with interfaces, genuinely skilled at making data visualizations that told compelling stories. I'd seen his work. It was objectively impressive. But impressive wasn't the same as robust. Pretty didn't always scale. And beautiful could collapse catastrophically under real-world conditions. My husband Michael found me in the kitchen that evening, standing before the refrigerator without actually seeing its contents. He'd learned long ago not to fill these silences immediately with reassurance. Michael worked in communication strategy at Northstar, which meant he understood the landscape of corporate politics with the kind of intimacy that comes from living inside it alongside someone else. "Bad day," he ventured eventually. Margot reassigned my sprint work to Marcus Wendell. The authentication module I'd been designing for months. I closed the refrigerator door without removing anything. According to her, his demos are flashier. Michael set down his laptop bag and moved to stand beside me. He was 6 inches taller, with the kind of steady presence that had drawn me to him 15 years ago when we first met at a coffee shop in Seattle. "So what will you be working on instead?" "That's the thing," she didn't actually specify. "Just that the module goes to Marcus because it photographs better for stakeholders." I turned to face him directly. "I've spent 90 days building the technical strategy, modeling the security protocols, designing the database architecture with future scaling in mind. And it gets handed to someone who knows how to make things look impressive in a presentation." Michael moved to the kitchen table and sat down, gesturing for me to join him. We'd had enough conversations like this that he understood the emotional topography without needing me to map it completely. "Walk me through what this actually means," he said. "Not the feeling, the logistics." I appreciated that about him. When I needed to process something complex, he helped me separate emotion from mechanics. The authentication system is foundational, I explained, settling into the chair across from him. Everything else depends on it: user login, permission verification, session management, API security. If it fails, nothing else works. It's the infrastructure that makes the rest of the application possible. Marcus's job was to make it beautiful. My job was to make it unbreakable. And now? Michael asked. Now Marcus gets to make it beautiful while presumably someone figures out who makes it unbreakable. Except nobody's been assigned that responsibility. Which means if there's a failure, the blame gets distributed across everyone except the person who made the decision to deprioritize actual engineering work. Michael leaned back, understanding crystallizing across his face. So she set up a scenario where if things go wrong, it's not her fault. Exactly. The demo is pristine, investors are impressed, and if the system fails later under real load, it's because the engineering team didn't account for something. She gets credit for the flashy presentation and insulation from the technical consequences. What's your move? He asked. That was the question, wasn't it? I'd been turning it over in my mind since Margot walked away. My move. I had options. I could request a transfer to another team. I could escalate to her manager, though that move typically marked you as someone who didn't handle disappointment gracefully. I could polish my resume and start interviewing elsewhere. All legitimate paths forward. But underneath those conventional responses was another possibility, one that required patience and a different kind of strategy. I didn't articulate it to Michael that evening. Instead, I said, I'm going to see what happens. He recognized that tone. It meant I'd already decided on something, just not the obvious thing. You're going to do something clever, he said. I'm going to do my job properly, I corrected. And I'm going to document everything I find. The sprint began on Monday morning with the standard team meeting. I sat in the conference room next to Marcus as he enthusiastically walked through his vision for the authentication interface. His mock-ups were beautiful: clean login screens, intuitive password recovery flows, elegant error messaging. The visual design was objectively excellent. He described a timeline for implementation that seemed optimistic to me, though he presented it with the kind of confidence that came from not fully understanding the complexity beneath the interface layer. I was reassigned to infrastructure maintenance, the unglamorous work of ensuring the platform remained stable, optimizing database queries, addressing technical debt that nobody celebrated. It was the kind of work that went unnoticed when it functioned correctly and generated immediate blame when something failed. Perfect. Because that's where the real power existed in any system, not in the visible layer that impressed people, but in the foundation that prevented everything from collapsing. I threw myself into it with deliberate thoroughness. The infrastructure codebase was vast: years of accumulated decisions, patches, workarounds, and optimizations. I began creating a comprehensive map of every system dependency, every edge case, every potential point of failure. I spent Tuesday morning documenting the database schema, tracing how authentication data flowed through the system. I mapped the cache layers, the API endpoints, the load balancing strategies. By Wednesday afternoon, I discovered something interesting in the legacy code, a race condition in the session management that would only manifest under specific concurrent load scenarios. The kind of bug that could remain dormant for months, running perfectly under controlled testing conditions, then surface catastrophically when real users hit the system simultaneously. It lived in code written years ago by someone who'd since left the company. The comment above the problematic function read simply, "To do, revisit thread safety under concurrent load." Someone had flagged it as a potential issue but never followed up. The kind of technical debt that accumulates in every rapidly growing company. I traced the bug to its source. It was in the token generation process. When multiple users logged in at exactly the same time, the system would occasionally create tokens with overlapping validity windows, which could theoretically allow unauthorized access or session hijacking. In practice, it was rare enough that it might never occur during normal usage. But under heavy concurrent load, during a high-traffic scenario like a major demo where multiple people were testing the system simultaneously, it would almost certainly trigger. I documented it meticulously. 17 pages of technical analysis, including code samples, the specific conditions that would trigger it, the potential consequences, and the recommended fix. Then I did nothing with the documentation except file it in a shared repository where it sat quietly, accessible but unannounced. On Thursday, I attended the infrastructure stand-up meeting and listened to Marcus describe his progress on authentication. He was charming, enthusiastic, full of technical-sounding terminology that betrayed a surface-level understanding of what he was actually building. He'd prioritized the visual interface elements, the login screens with their subtle gradients and smooth transitions, the password recovery flow with its animated confirmations, all the components that would look excellent during a demo when the product team stood at the front of a conference room and walked investors through the user experience. The underlying validation logic, the security layer, the error handling, the edge case management, those were secondary in his timeline. He'd mentioned them briefly, noting that they'd be handled in later sprints once the interface was locked down. It was a common approach in organizations where visibility was valued more than stability. I nodded along, asked clarifying questions about database schema to understand exactly how deeply his code was integrated with the back-end systems, and said nothing about the race condition. By Friday afternoon, I completed my assigned infrastructure work. 3 new performance optimizations that would reduce database query times by an average of 38%. 2 critical security patches that addressed vulnerabilities in the API gateway. Comprehensive documentation updated across 15 different system components. Nobody commented on it during the retrospective. That was fine. I didn't expect fanfare for baseline competence. The sprint demo was scheduled for the following Wednesday. Margot had been explicit about the focus during the planning meeting. She wanted to showcase the new authentication experience to Moonlight's Series B investors. The ones who controlled $2 million in funding decisions. The ones who would be walking through the application, testing it, looking for evidence that the engineering team could actually deliver on their roadmap. I spent the weekend preparing. Not sabotaging. Preparing. There was a meaningful distinction. On Monday, I was back at my desk before 8 in the morning. I began reviewing the authentication system Marcus had built over the previous 5 days, ostensibly to coordinate the infrastructure layer with his new code. What I was actually doing was identifying the precise conditions that would trigger the race condition I'd documented weeks earlier. Marcus had deployed his code to the staging environment on Friday afternoon without running the full concurrent load tests. A rookie mistake, the kind that happens when you're focused on visual polish rather than foundational stability. I could see exactly where the vulnerability lived, in the session token generation process when multiple requests hit the system simultaneously. He'd used a straightforward sequential approach to token creation, which was fine for serial testing but failed catastrophically under parallel requests. I spent Monday and Tuesday quietly documenting the interaction between Marcus's new authentication layer and the infrastructure layer I'd built. I created a detailed technical report that outlined how the components would interact under various loading conditions. I noted that the authentication module appeared to lack concurrent load testing. I flagged the specific code sections that showed potential race conditions. I included recommendations for remediation. I filed the report in the shared repository where anyone with system access could read it. The file name was clear: authentication_module_technical_review_dash_load testing_recommendations.md. I sent no email. I made no announcement. I simply placed evidence in a location where it would be discovered after any catastrophic failure but remained invisible during the demo prep phase. Tuesday afternoon, I ran a separate private test in my own isolated environment. I created synthetic concurrent load against the authentication system and watched the race condition trigger exactly as predicted. The token generation began failing after approximately 300 simultaneous login attempts. The failure cascaded. As the token process broke down, the entire session management layer became unreliable. I documented this test as well, creating timestamped logs that would be verifiable later. At 3 p.m., I was pulled into a meeting with Margot and Marcus. They looked anxious, the kind of anxiety that comes when you realize your sprint work isn't quite ready for investor scrutiny but you've committed to a timeline and backing out now would signal weakness to the funding partners. The demo is tomorrow, Margot said, her voice carrying an undercurrent of pressure. I need both of you to confirm everything is stable. Marcus assured her it was. He'd tested the interface thoroughly, he explained. The user flows were smooth. The visual design was polished. Everything looked and felt exactly how they wanted it to appear to investors. Margot looked at me. Infrastructure? All systems are optimized and stable on my end, I said, which was perfectly true. Everything I'd built was functioning exactly as designed. I'd documented my technical recommendations for the authentication module in the shared repository. You should review those before the demo just to be prepared for any technical questions. What kind of questions? Margot asked, tension sharpening her voice. Just recommendations for production hardening, I said calmly. Standard load testing protocols. Nothing critical, just best practices documentation. She nodded, but something in my tone had registered. I watched her make a mental note, one she would forget about until tomorrow when events made her remember it with perfect clarity. That evening, after Marcus and most of the engineering team had left for the day, I made a small adjustment to the staging environment's database load parameters. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that could be traced back to deliberate sabotage. Just a setting that reflected more realistic concurrent user behavior, the kind of load the system would actually experience with real investors testing the interface simultaneously, multiple users logging in, multiple sessions being created, multiple permission checks happening at once. It was the kind of realistic load that any competent engineer would test against before unleashing code on actual paying customers. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of clarity that comes when you know exactly what's about to happen. I watched from my desk as Marcus and Margot made their final preparations in the demo area on the first floor. The conference room had been carefully staged, the best conference table position to showcase the interface, comfortable chairs arranged for the investors, a projector set to display the application at high resolution. Investors were scheduled to arrive at 10 a.m. There were 6 of them, apparently, partners from 3 different venture firms who were collectively deciding whether Moonlight Technologies merited additional capital investment. At 9:47, the first authentication failures began. Subtle at first, the system became sluggish, response time stretching from milliseconds to seconds. The race condition I'd identified weeks ago triggered under the realistic concurrent load. Users attempting to log in experienced delays. Some sessions failed to initialize. Others returned error states. By 9:53, the problem had accelerated into something obvious. Session tokens stopped generating reliably. The authentication system, which was supposed to be the gateway for everything else, became a locked door. I watched this unfold from my desk through the window overlooking the demo space. Marcus's face went pale. He began frantically checking logs on his laptop, searching for the failure point like someone looking for keys in the dark. Margot's expression cycled through confusion to alarm to controlled fury. I could almost see her mental calculation, how long before the investors arrived, whether there was any possibility of recovery, what story she could construct to explain the catastrophe. The investors arrived at exactly 10 a.m., right on schedule. They were ushered into the conference room. Margot stepped forward with her presentation smile, the one she practiced in mirror. Marcus clicked to his first demo screen. The investors leaned forward, ready to be impressed by the visual elegance of the interface that would justify $2 million in capital allocation. The application hung. The beautiful interface became a waiting cursor. The authentication system, overwhelmed by realistic concurrent load, had stopped functioning. One of the investors checked her watch. Another pulled out a phone, presumably to take a call. A third asked if there was a technical issue. Margot's smile froze at approximately the same moment Marcus realized the problem wasn't going away. They tried to restart the system. It failed again under the same realistic concurrent load conditions. They tried to revert to a backup. That took 15 minutes, during which 6 venture capital partners sat in an awkward silence, watching a company they were considering investing in fail to demonstrate basic technical competence. Marcus ran to my desk at 10:38, his face flushed with panic and frustration. Margot arrived 30 seconds later, her composure abandoned, her voice shaking. "Why is the app full of bugs?" she demanded. Marcus said everything was tested. I trusted. I looked up calmly from my monitor where I'd been reviewing code, the picture of composed professionalism. "I filed a technical report about the session management vulnerability on Monday," I said quietly, my voice steady and clear. "It details exactly where the race condition exists and the specific conditions that trigger it. I also noted that the authentication module wasn't subjected to concurrent load testing before deployment. That documentation is in the shared repository. It's been there since Monday afternoon at 2:47 p.m., according to the timestamp. Feel free to review it." She stared at me, understanding beginning to crystallize across her features. The infrastructure systems are running perfectly, I continued, keeping my voice level and professional. Everything I'm responsible for has been tested thoroughly and continues to operate as designed. If there are questions about other systems, you'll want to consult the technical documentation I prepared. Margot's jaw tightened. She had nothing to say, no comeback available in this moment. The situation was clear, I had done my job correctly, completely, with full documentation filed in a location that was theoretically accessible to her but practically invisible until it needed to be found. The failure belonged entirely to Marcus's incomplete work and her decision-making process. She walked away without another word, moving back toward the investors with the beginnings of a damage control narrative forming visibly across her expression. The investigation that followed took 2 days and involved people at levels above Margot's authority. The VP of Engineering reviewed my documentation and confirmed the technical accuracy of my analysis. The race condition was exactly where I'd said it was. The load testing protocols were exactly as essential as I'd indicated. The timeline showed that I'd filed my report before the demo was ever scheduled for execution. A senior engineer was assigned to fix the authentication module. It took him 12 hours to implement the corrections I'd already designed months earlier, the very corrections that Marcus's approach had abandoned in favor of visual polish. The engineering team reviewed my documentation, confirmed the race condition, traced it back to inadequate testing protocols. Marcus's deployment process was flagged as substandard. His approach to building authentication without proper security and load testing validation became a case study in what not to do. Margot's judgment in prioritizing aesthetic appeal over technical rigor was questioned by the VP of Engineering in a meeting that apparently involved considerable candor about the decision-making process that had led to this failure. I was asked to provide a complete technical audit of the authentication module, the work I'd originally been assigned 3 months earlier. I completed it in 8 hours, delivering a document that outlined exactly what should have been done from the beginning. The work was methodical, thorough, and unassailably competent. Every line of code was annotated. Every architectural decision was explained. Every potential failure point was addressed. By Friday, Margot's decision to reassign my sprint work was quietly reversed in a meeting with upper management. The decision was presented to me as a restoration of the original assignment, with no explicit acknowledgement of the error. I was reinstated as the lead on authentication. The module would be rebuilt using my original specifications, the ones I'd outlined months ago, the ones that incorporated proper security protocols and scaling architecture. Marcus was moved to a different project under close supervision, working on interface design for non-critical systems where beautiful code mattered more than unbreakable code. Nobody used the word apology. That wasn't how these situations concluded at Moonlight Technologies. But the repositioning was clear enough. I'd been validated not through dramatic confrontation but through the simple reality of demonstrated competence. The investors, once the system was fixed, returned for a follow-up demo 2 weeks later. The authentication system was flawless. The interface, built correctly, actually worked. I spent the following week rebuilding the authentication module using my original design. The work moved smoothly. I already understood every requirement, every technical consideration, every edge case. I implemented token rotation mechanisms that would have been impossible under Marcus's approach. I built redundancy into the database layer. I created comprehensive error handling that would prevent cascading failures across the system. Michael asked how I felt that evening as we sat on the back porch of our house in Portland, watching the sunset fade into darkness. The October air had turned cool, and the trees were beginning their transition into autumn colors. We'd bought the house 5 years ago after I'd received a promotion at Moonlight. It felt strange to be sitting here now, looking out at the yard we'd built together, feeling simultaneously vindicated and exhausted. Vindicated, I said finally. But also tired. Tired of working in environments where flashier trumps better, where image matters more than substance. So what's next? He asked, taking my hand. I thought about that. I'd proven my point. I'd demonstrated that intelligence and patience could outmaneuver arrogance and carelessness. The victory was real, but it tasted like something that required me to play a game I'd never asked to play. More importantly, it required me to build my professional reputation around the fact that I'd been right all along, rather than simply being allowed to do good work without having to prove it. I'm going to finish rebuilding the authentication system properly, I said. It deserves to be built well. And then I'm going to start looking at other opportunities. Places where technical excellence is actually valued on its own merits, where doing the right thing doesn't require elaborate strategic patience. Michael squeezed my hand. He understood. We sat in comfortable silence as the evening cooled around us, the victory settling into something quieter and more permanent than triumph. It was the satisfaction that comes from knowing you were right all along, combined with the clarity that being right in the wrong environment wasn't the same as success. 3 days of composure had delivered its own form of justice. But it had also taught me something about the cost of that kind of patience. Real peace, I realized, wouldn't come from outmaneuvering Margot or proving myself superior to Marcus. It would come from finding a place where I didn't have to prove anything at all. I spent the next month finishing the authentication module. Every function was tested against concurrent loads. Every error path was mapped. Every security consideration was documented. I implemented features that Marcus never would have conceived of, things like automatic token expiration, distributed session validation, and graceful degradation under extreme load. When the system went live, it was indistinguishable from any other well-built authentication system. It didn't crash. It didn't leak data. It didn't create the kinds of security vulnerabilities that kept security teams awake at night. It was invisible in the way that only truly excellent infrastructure can be invisible. It worked so well that nobody noticed it working. Margot thanked me in an all-hands meeting, positioning the authentication system as evidence of Moonlight's technical capabilities. She did not mention that this system had originally been assigned to Marcus, or that the initial version had failed catastrophically in front of investors. She simply spoke about how impressed she was with the team's commitment to excellence. Marcus was already looking for a new job, apparently. I heard through office gossip that he'd put himself on the market, claiming he wanted to pursue interface design more exclusively. The company apparently gave him a positive reference. In corporate environments, it's easier to help people leave than to document their failures. I received an offer from a company called Cascade Systems, a mid-stage startup that was building infrastructure for distributed systems. They wanted someone who understood how authentication could work at scale, someone who'd built systems that could handle millions of concurrent users. The technical interview involved explaining my design philosophy, not proving that I was clever, but simply articulating why I made certain architectural decisions. The lead engineer on their team listened carefully, asked thoughtful follow-up questions, and at the end said, "This is exactly how we think about the problem." I gave Moonlight Technologies my 2 weeks' notice on a Friday afternoon. Margot accepted my resignation in a meeting that lasted approximately 90 seconds. She asked if there was anything they could do to keep me. I mentioned that I'd value an organization where technical excellence was recognized as valuable in itself, without requiring elaborate strategic patience to prove its worth. She offered me a raise. I declined politely.